Hey guys, welcome back, and in this screencast I just want to go quickly over Axis CSS, which is the CSS library that ships with roots. So you'll notice that if you go into the CSS master file, there's a couple of mix-ins here, there's a couple imports, and things that you might not be familiar with. In addition, we have a pretty extensive settings file here with a whole bunch of values, and I just want to go through these really quickly. The best place to start is if you go to roots.cx, which is the main roots website, /axis, which you can get to right over here. I've written out some pretty extensive documentation on how Axis works and a little bit about how stylus generally works. And so the introduction I would encourage you to read. It's just about how to make these mix-ins execute. The most important piece being that when you're using a mix-in nested under a selector, you can actually write it just as you would write a normal CSS property. So you can say the name of the mix-in followed by a colon, and then the arguments are space separated after it, and you'll see this throughout the example video. But when you're calling the mix-in with no arguments, you need to postfix it with a open and close paren, just to indicate that it is indeed a mix-in that you're calling rather than just another property in there. So I just want to go through a couple of things in here, just scroll quickly through this documentation and demonstrate a few of the pieces for you guys. The first thing on the agenda is the settings, and so if we go back and check this out, you can see that this is fairly well explained. It's not too difficult to get down with, but I just want to run quickly through this. So up top are a few default font stacks, and these guys I always have a hard time remembering what to put all the way down the stack to cover every platform. But all these defaults are kind of mocked out for you. And if you want to add your own font stack, or you just want to put your own font before one of the other font stacks, for example, you might want Open Sans to be the default if you're loading that from Google. And then if for some reason that goes wrong, you can load Helvetica. That would be an easy way to handle it. In addition, there's a default font size that goes in there when you execute base, which sets the base typography values, a default font color, and you can see that I've also overridden all of the default browser colors to values that are a little bit more tasteful than the very harsh and grating full values by default. So just to demonstrate that briefly, I'm going to go in here and throw down a paragraph selector, make the color red, and when we go back to this tab you can see that it's already changed to red, and this is not like that harsh default grading 100% R channel red that we get by default. It's a little bit more tasteful, and if that's not your thing and you really like those defaults, you can just feel free to get rid of this line and it will go back to the default, or you can change this to your own value. It's often a good idea to use color variables for your website, just because if anything changes down the line, you only have to change it in one spot. And in addition, writing something like color red is a lot more easy to read and sensical than copy and pasting these random looking hex colors all over your style sheet. So this is a good section to check out. And when you're setting the default kind of colors palette for your website, it's good to make these adjustments and make sure everything's set up here. In addition, there are vendor prefixes. I would certainly recommend leaving these here, but if for some reason you don't want to target some browser, then you could take them out. Image paths we'll talk about in a little bit. It's a very useful mix-in. Pi is Progressive Internet Explorer, and by default I don't have that enabled because some people get bothered by the effects it produces in old Internet Explorer. For me and for many other people, it's a lot easier to debug with this guy on, but by all means you can check out css3pi.com and decide whether you want to enable that or not. And again, we've got the pi.htc file straight in the JS folder, so you can put it wherever you want and adjust the path so that it gets loaded correctly. And for any mix-in that has things that aren't supported by old Internet Explorer, like rounded corners or gradients, pi will be automatically applied to that as long as it's turned on. Finally, there's grid settings, and the grid bundled with roots is semantic.js, which I'll just check out very briefly if I can. So yeah, I didn't feel like there was any reason to reinvent the wheel and make yet another grid system just for roots. I'm not a really heavy user of grids myself, actually, but I know there are a lot of grid frameworks out there, and semantic.js is very light, very simple, and very well updated, and runs on many different languages, which is great. And there are some really nice examples here of how you can make things fluid, responsive, and flexible, which you can feel free to check out. if you are a heavy user of grid systems. So just wanted to go through that briefly. Let's go back to the docs here and keep on moving. You can see that there are two different ways to reset at the beginning. I definitely prefer normalize, which is why I've made it the default, rather than getting rid of all default browser style sheets. This will just normalize all the default browser style sheets so that they look the same across every browser. And oftentimes, you will end up having a list that has to have bullets and a little bit of indentation, or your paragraphs will actually need a little bit of padding on the top and bottom. And so having normalize in here is a nice base to start at. But if you really just want to kill every single style that could possibly get in there, you can just swap that out for global reset, and everything will be fine. Next point I wanted to hit quickly is vendor prefixing. And as it says here, everybody hates vendor prefixing. It's a huge pain. There's a lot of different solutions to it. It's something extra to think about, and it clutters up your style sheets. We've taken care of all of that for you with roots, so you don't need to vendor prefix anything. You never need to think about vendor prefixes again. They don't need to be written at any time. Anything that needs to be vendor prefixed will be properly for you. This is all built into the back end of roots, and it will just be taken care of. So don't ever worry about vendor prefixing. Take joy in your now very clean and readable style sheets. And as you can see here, there's a couple examples of properties that are notorious for having 4 or 5 lines at each time that you need to write it. But it's very easy to use just with roots here. Next point, positioning. This is pretty straightforward, so I don't think I'm going to demonstrate this. Actually I will demonstrate it quickly. So you can do relative or absolute positioning in one line. Instead of using 3 lines for this, it does seem a little bit counterintuitive to span this one statement of like position this absolutely 5 pixels from the top across 2 different lines. So let me just make an example div here. Let's say I'm going to get rid of our hello world and do box. And in here, let's select box. I want to set the size for that box. And so here's another interesting piece of roots, which is in the documentation, but I think I won't get to it. I don't want to spend too much time on this video. Instead of setting the width to 50 pixels and the height to 50 pixels, which is really a pain, you end up doing it all the time, and it's just, I really don't like doing it. I'd rather compress this into one line where I can just set the width and the height. So I'd say size 50 pixels, right? And just like margin or padding, you should be able to actually take it down to one property. And so if I say size 50 pixels, then this will set the width and the height to both the same thing. And in fact, pixel usually ends up being what I set size in. And so the pixels is the default for the size mix-in. So I can actually take off pixels and this will still work fine. Or if I want another unit like ems, I could set that. You're certainly not forced to use pixels, but pixels is the default if you don't set any unit at all. And so this is what we can abbreviate down that width and height declaration to, which is really convenient. I'm going to just set a border so we can make sure that this is indeed showing up. And here we see we've got our little box there already. And now if I want to set it to be absolutely positioned, let's say from the top I want it 30 pixels, and from the left I want it 50 pixels. You can see that it's moved out a little bit here, and I already had a padding on the body of 50 pixels, so that's why it actually moved up when I refreshed it. So I'll just bump that up a little bit, and now you can see this is really easy to move around, and this is much more of a compressed statement, so this is really great with the positioning utilities. The grid we just went over, I'm not going to demo this too hard here. I'm actually not much of a user of grids myself, as I mentioned before, but this is fairly straightforward. You can use column and rows, and you can set up your default column and row width. And using total width will allow this to be responsive if you set it to a % value. A bunch of utilities here. I just demoed the size one, which is really great. These two also super convenient. It's just such a pain to write out font weight bold every time you want something bold. All I want to do is just write bold and have it be bold. And so I made my dreams complete here with this bold one. Same with italic, and same with normal, which will just remove all the bold and italic from the text. Same thing for clear fix. This is one I end up using all the time. And as you guys probably know, if you've written a lot of CSS, it can be a real pain using floats. And whenever you use floats, you're going to want to overflow hidden or clear fix any of the containers that the float's in, or else it will kind of spill over into other elements. And so this is a really super easy way to implement the clear fix. And if you're really stuck on clear fix for some reason, I don't understand that name, it makes no sense, then you can use that one too. But group makes sense for me. Whenever I have elements that are floated inside of a container, I'll just throw group on the container and I'll kind of group all those elements together and not let the float get outside of there, which is great. And there's a whole lot more utilities here that I can show. BG you saw earlier in the documentation. This is super convenient. If you want a background image, it will just get rid of the necessity to use the URL thing and the no repeat. It's basically just because I always end up going background URL, /image/ whatever .png, and then no repeat. And all of this tends to be boilerplate most of the time when I'm just trying to set a single background image. So I just kind of shorten that out here. And so if you want to, you can just go BG, you can get rid of this URL piece, and you can get rid of no repeat. And in addition, we saw earlier in the settings that there's an image path variable. And so what you can do here is if all of your images are always in image like this, you can set that as the default path, right? And so now in here, I don't have to write image on every single one because that's automatically injected before it. And so this is a very nice and clean way to be able to set background images. And for any roots mixin that injects a background image, like there's one for image replacement where you have to pass a, again, you have to pass a path followed by a size. And this will take a text node, it will clear the text out using that big text indent negative thing, and it'll put an image over it. This will also be affected by the image path, so it's really nice to have that there. It will make your style sheets a whole lot cleaner. So I just wanted to show that briefly. And going down here, I'm going to skip through most of these. Typography, there's a lot of really useful ones. Abbreviations here, just like FS, font size a lot to type out. I'd rather just type FS, and so that's just a straight up abbreviation. Use it if you want. Upcase and downcase, again, these are just long things I end up typing a lot in typography that I wanted to take down a little bit. There are default styles for headings, there's default styles for links with a bunch of different options. There are resets for links, which is really useful. The number of times I've put text decoration none is unbelievable. So I really like typing out reset link and not having to reset the color manually and reset the text decoration, etc., etc. The list ones are one I want to show off really quickly. So I'm going to go back in here and I'm going to just get rid of our box and just type in a quick list here. And so saving this, if we go back here, you can see we've got the default styles in this list. We've got the extra padding, we've got the extra margins, we've got those bullets, and stripping this off is something I find myself doing very frequently. And so I kind of wanted to bundle that up. And if you just want to reset the styles, it's very easy to just run reset list here, and you can see that all that extra margin padding, all of the list styles and everything got stripped off with really no effort whatsoever. In addition, I oftentimes find myself trying to set lists to be inline, whether that means floating it left and grouping or clear fixing the parent, or whether it means using inline block. Luckily, I have inline list here, and so this is a very easy way to change your list to be inline. And these by default will separate by 20 pixels here, but if you want to change that, it's super straightforward. No separation, set it to 0. If you want some pretty big separation, you can set it to 50 pixels, and this will spread out a pretty decent amount. And so these utilities I end up using all the time. Super useful. They'll save you a ton of time. And you can see there are some other ones here that'll set up these base settings for you. Tables, very straightforward. They're ported right from Twitter Bootstrap. I hate dealing with tables. They did a good job with their tables. Very simple, flat tables with borders, and they look nice. And so you can just use one mixin, put this on all of your tables. If you have tables, I almost always use this one, which is a root level mixin, as I say here. And so if you just run tables like this will just automatically throw these root styles on any table that you insert in your document, which is just great. Gradients I do want to show very briefly, just because these save a lot of time. So let's go back into our file, and I'm going to make a div called gradient. And back in here, let's get rid of this UL. Select gradient. I'm going to again set a size here. We'll go 200 width and 80 height. And for the background, you know, gradient's usually very painful with all the prefixing and such. We can just call gradient directly, and I'll have it go from red to green. A beautiful, not sickly looking gradient. And so here it is. It's all panned out for us immediately, which is super convenient. I can change this very quickly. And in addition, there's another really nice mix-in that Ridge ships with. Oftentimes you'll just want a red gradient, right? Where it'll just start with a lighter red. In the middle will be like an even red, and the bottom will be a little darker. So if we change this to simple gradient, you can see that it will actually just make a very simple gradient that goes light to dark here for us. And if we look in the docs under gradients, you can see that there is simple gradient here, and we have a second potential optional argument for strength. And so if this is too weak of a simple gradient for you and you want it to be a little stronger, you can always add in a second argument. 20% will make that pop a little bit harder. And so that's that. Let's move on. Forms, there's a bunch of really nice styles. I can't stand dealing with forms. I didn't want to limit anyone in the markup, but having default styles here for just making the fields look a little bit nicer, disabling the fields, error warning, success states, these things are useful to have on occasion. Continuing to go through here, we have code. Making your code blocks look nice is a good thing, and so these will just clean up your code blocks and make them look sweet. All the code examples here, it just puts them in monospace. It makes the color a little bit brighter, and you can set the color yourself. You can see the default here is this kind of reddy orange color, which really makes the code block stand out. And if you're using a pre, it will just, you can do the highlighting yourself, of course, but it'll put it in a nice block in monospace, which is great. Another great section is interaction, and so oftentimes you probably will find yourself implementing the same sort of hover effects, like this button will darken up on hover a little bit, this one will lighten up on hover a little bit. We can actually abstract those all the way out, and these will read your background colors already and darken or lighten them. So let's actually demonstrate that really quick. I'm just going to set the background to red again, and let's check this out. We took the size out, so let's put that size back on, and here we are. So now if I do hover darken, whoops, and just execute that, you can see that this will just darken out when I hover it, which is pretty sweet. And if I want to pass a percentage, I can do that. So this will be a pretty heavy darken, almost all the way down to black. If I want to transition that, I can throw the transition mix in on here, and that'll be a nice transition on hover. And I can do the same thing with lighten, which is pretty sweet. So that will lighten it out pretty significantly. You can see that there are other ones, such as underlining it when you hover, which is frequent, having it pop out a little bit with a shadow. This is not as frequent, but it's a kind of cool effect to have there if you're really trying to have something stand out. Hover fade is a good one, just having the opacity come down a little bit. And so same with hover color. This will just have a nice transition to a different color as soon as you set transition on this. Easing, we know that there's only a couple of defaults. It's just linear and ease by default, and so you can also set the Bezier function to do all these different types of easing, but that's really a pain looking those up every time, actually figuring out what the numbers are. So conveniently enough, there's a bunch of different easing functions here that are just built into roots. And so if you're setting a transition, it's super easy to just say, let's see, transition all 0.5 seconds, and then we'll say ease in quart. Right, and there we go. Let's see if this makes any difference. So yeah, you could see that it's kind of starts slow and ends very quickly. And this looks really natural here, just almost like it was supposed to be in CSS, which really I do think it should be in CSS by default. So these are nice, and there's a little demonstration of how each one looks here if you're confused about it. Buttons is another thing that I want to show off really briefly. You can see that there are two different styles. There's the kind of flatter, more basic style that you can build up yourself, or there's a more polished and finished style with a little bit more affordance here. So I just want to demonstrate this really briefly. I'm going to make a button div and say click me for that. And back in our style sheet, we can get rid of all of this stuff here and select button. And under here, I'm just going to call button straight up. And so you could see here that we already have a really nice looking button here, which is just fantastic. If we want to change the color of this, it's super straightforward to do. I could just change it to green here. And now we have a green button, which is pretty sweet. We've got the hover and active state already set up. If I want to make it a more simple and flat button that I can build up myself, just change it to simple. Still got that hover and active state, which is great. If I want to change the size, I can just set it to large, perhaps. That would bump it up a little bit. I could set it to small. Medium is the default. Or I can pass in a custom size myself. So let's say I do 30, which would map to a font size of 30. So this is a pretty big button right here, but you can see everything scales really nicely and proportionally. And if I take off the simple again, even all of these extra layer effects will scale very nicely, including the gradient, the text shadows, etc. So this is a really convenient, quick way to make buttons. Buttons end up being standard a lot of the time, and it's just a pain to write out all these styles. And if we go to the actual source and check this out, you can see there's a whole lot of styles on here. You know, this is not something that you want to be writing out manually. A lot of gradients going on, a lot of border radius stuff going on, box shadows, everything getting prefixed. So this is just saving an absolutely enormous amount of time, including all of the hover, focus, and active states. Really, really nice and convenient. So let's just go back to localhost like we were before. So that's buttons really quickly. You can disable them as well. There's a bunch of UI elements here, generic area that you can put text in. There are notices inside of bubbles. You can have flash notices. If you've ever built a Rails app, you're probably familiar with flash notices. Really convenient default styles here. They'll look really nice. You can just throw them on there and not worry about it. Breadcrumb paths are really good. You can see these for navigation sometimes. You can change the character in between them, so this could be a dot or whatever. Really nice stuff. Bubbles, these are often a huge pain getting this little triangle down here, and then if you have a border, right, getting the second triangle down there using the after element and bumping it down 1 pixel. It's just so much markup to get one of those buttons in there. And we can start to see it, I guess, if we inspect the element on here. Just so much markup. It's really, really a pain. Here's the before element. Here's the after element. But these bubbles come up all the time in any sort of UI design, and so abbreviating this is super convenient. And you can change the position of this pointer to the left, the center, or the right. You can change the color, you can set a manual width, etc. Here's default styles for images. It'll set that caption to be centered, it'll set it to be italic, get a little colored border around the image. All of these things are really just for convenience, very common patterns that I see all the time in design that we can abbreviate and abstract out to flexible mix-ins. And that's really the basis of Axis. So I just wanted to show you guys quickly. Again, Axis has its own GitHub repo if you want to get at it. And so it is right up in here. And the code is pretty straightforward. There's nothing crazy in here. It's all just a bunch of stylus mix-in style sheets in here. And so feel free to check this out and contribute, or you can pull this into your own projects without using root standalone, and there are instructions for doing that here. So thank you guys so much for checking out this screencast, and I will be back with some more stuff on dynamic content and pre-compiled templates coming up next.